Stepmom and her daughters took over my dad's house, but they had no clue who really owned it. 10 years ago, I bought a house for my father, Henry, after my mother, Laura, passed away. She was the love of his life, and after she was gone, he was just lost. He still had Max, their golden retriever, who had been my mom's shadow for years, but even that didn't seem to be enough. I knew he needed stability, a place to call home where he could grieve and rebuild. So I bought him a house, $750,000, nestled in a beautiful, prestigious neighborhood, the kind of place my parents had always dreamed of but never could quite afford when I was growing up. At first, it was just him and Max. I'd visit every weekend, make sure he was eating, try to get him out of the house. It was tough, but eventually he found a routine. The house became his space, his sanctuary. He'd do little projects in the yard, take Max on long walks, chat with the neighbors. It felt like he was slowly finding his footing again. And then, after a decade of being a widower, he met Diana. Diana was a lot. She was younger than him, mid-50s compared to his early 60s, and had this air of effortless charm. The kind of woman who knew how to make everyone feel like they were the only person in the room. She worked at a small boutique downtown, selling overpriced candles and hand-woven scarves to rich suburban moms. My dad met her there when he was out shopping for a birthday present for my aunt. It was fast. Too fast. One minute, he was casually mentioning her in conversation. "Oh, I met this nice woman, she's got a great laugh," and the next, they were inseparable. By the time I met her, maybe 2 months in, she was already calling him babe and making plans for their future. I tried to be supportive. My dad had been alone for so long, and if this made him happy, who was I to judge? But something about Diana just didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the way she talked about my mom, always a little too dismissive, like she was eager to erase her from the house. Or maybe it was the way she moved in so seamlessly, like she had been waiting for this exact opportunity. Because yeah, that's exactly what happened. Within 6 months they were married. A tiny, courthouse ceremony, no big celebration, just a piece of paper that legally bound them together. And just like that, Diana wasn't just my dad's girlfriend, she was his wife. And the house? Well, she saw that as hers now too. The first real red flag was Mac, my mom's dog. My dad's loyal companion for over a decade. Diana didn't like him. Said he was too old, too smelly, too much work. I found out later she had been pushing my dad to get rid of him. At first, he resisted, but then Max mysteriously started having accidents in the house, something he hadn't done since he was a puppy. My dad was confused, swore he didn't know what was going on, but I had my suspicions. Then, one day Max was just gone. My dad told me he had run away. A 12-year-old dog who barely made it up the stairs had somehow decided to sprint off into the night. Right. That was the first time I really confronted my dad about Diana, told him I didn't trust her. He brushed me off, said I was overreacting, that Diana just had different tastes. But it wasn't just the dog. It was the way she started redecorating. Little by little, all the things that reminded him of my mom disappeared. The old wedding photos came down. The furniture got replaced. Even the curtains my mom had picked out were suddenly too dated and needed to go. And then, one day, I found out something that made my stomach drop. The house, the one I had bought, paid for in full, and put in his name, was now in both their names. I found out completely by accident. I was helping my dad sort through some paperwork when I saw the deed. At some point, without mentioning it to me, he had added Diana as a co-owner of the house. I confronted him immediately. "Dad, what the hell is this?" He looked at me like a kid caught sneaking cookies before dinner. "Diana thought it made sense," he said, like that explained anything. "You know, in case anything happens to me." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "In case anything happens to you? Dad, you own this house. I bought it for you. Why would you need to put Diana on the deed?" He sighed, rubbing his temples like I was the one being difficult. "She's my wife, Alex. It's not that big of a deal." Not that big of a deal. The house that I had bought with my own money was now half Diana's. And if something happened to my dad, it would all be hers. I left that conversation feeling sick. My dad was a smart man. How could he be this blind? This naive? That's when I started digging into Diana's past. And what I found confirmed every suspicion I'd had. Diana had been married twice before. Both times to older men. Both times, those men had mysteriously changed their wills, putting her as the main beneficiary. And both times, within a few years of marriage, they had, tragically, passed away. I wasn't about to let my dad be next. But before I could figure out how to stop this, something happened that changed everything. My dad had a medical scare, a mild heart attack. He was fine, but it was a wake-up call for him. He called me from the hospital, sounding more exhausted than I'd ever heard him. "Alex," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I think I made a mistake." Diana hadn't even come to the hospital. When he called her, she said she was busy and would check in later. But you know who did show up? A lawyer. One Diana had hired. She wanted my dad to sign a new will. And guess who was set to inherit everything? I knew, in that moment, that I had to do something. I wasn't going to let her take everything from him, everything from me. So I made a plan. At first, Diana moving into the house wasn't a huge deal. My dad seemed happy, even if I had my doubts about her. I figured if she was taking care of him and giving him some companionship, then fine. It was his life, and I wasn't going to micromanage it. But what I didn't expect was what came next: her daughters. 6 months after Diana and my dad got married, her 2 grown daughters, Lisa and Kelly, moved in. And when I say moved in, I mean they arrived with bags in hand and never left. Lisa was 36, Kelly was 34, both fully capable of living on their own, yet suddenly, they were treating my father's house as if it had been handed to them on a silver platter. At first, I tried to be civil. I told myself maybe they were just getting back on their feet. Maybe they had lost their apartments or were dealing with financial struggles. But no, that wasn't the case at all. Lisa had a stable remote job in some kind of customer service role, and Kelly had been a hairstylist for years. They weren't struggling. They were just freeloaders. From the moment they settled in, they acted like the house was theirs. It started small. Rearranging furniture, moving my dad's things around, replacing decorations that my mom had picked out years ago. But then it escalated. My dad, who had spent the last decade living in that house comfortably, suddenly found himself being pushed to the background. Lisa took over the living room, spreading her stuff everywhere, leaving her work set up in the middle of the space like it was her personal office. Kelly, who acted like she was allergic to responsibility, started treating my dad's kitchen like her own but never actually cleaned up after herself. They ate his food without asking, took over his favorite spots in the house, and worst of all, started making him feel like a guest in his own home. Diana didn't just let it happen, she encouraged it. Every time my dad voiced even the slightest concern, she'd shut him down. "They're family now, Henry," she'd say in that condescending tone of hers, as if my dad was some clueless old man who didn't understand how things worked. The real conflict started when Kelly decided she was scared of Max. Max had been with my dad ever since my mom passed. That dog was more than just a pet. He was a link to my mom, a companion my dad could count on. But Kelly started making a big deal about how Max was aggressive and how she couldn't relax, knowing he was in the house. Mind you, Max was 12 years old at this point, barely had the energy to climb up on the couch, and had never shown a hint of aggression toward anyone in his life. At first, my dad brushed it off. "Max won't bother you," he said, trying to be reasonable. But Kelly kept escalating it. She started accidentally closing doors, locking Max outside for hours, and making little passive-aggressive comments about how some dogs just aren't safe to have around. I knew what she was doing. She wanted Max gone. One day, I came over and noticed Max had been shoved into the laundry room. He was whining at the door, clearly confused. When I asked my dad about it, he just sighed. "Kelly says he makes her uncomfortable," he said, rubbing his temples like he was too exhausted to argue anymore. That was it for me. I wasn't going to let this woman come into my father's home and dictate whether he could keep his own dog. I told him, "Dad, I'll take Max. He can stay with me." My dad hesitated. I could see the guilt on his face. He didn't want to give up his dog. But he also didn't want to keep fighting with Diana and her daughters. I hated seeing him like that. The next weekend, I drove the 100 kilometers to my dad's house, loaded Max into my car, and brought him home with me. My house was smaller, and I wasn't around as much because of work, but I made sure Max was comfortable. I gave him his own space, made time to take him on walks, and promised my dad he could visit anytime. But that wasn't enough for Kelly. The moment Max was gone, she started acting like she had won some kind of battle. She spread out even more, made herself even more at home, and my dad? He was getting smaller in his own house. I could see it in the way he stopped fighting back, in the way he avoided conflict just to keep the peace. And that's when I knew, this wasn't just about Max. Kelly and Lisa weren't just freeloaders. They were slowly taking over, and Diana was letting it happen. And I wasn't about to let my dad get pushed out of his own home. Not without a fight. After Max was gone from the house, things only got worse for my dad. It was like removing that last piece of my mom's presence gave Diana and her daughters the final green light to take over completely. The house, which had once been my father's sanctuary, slowly became their territory. My dad had less and less say in what happened under his own roof, and anytime he tried to push back, Diana and her daughters acted like he was being unreasonable. At first, it was just small things. They started rearranging the furniture, replacing everything my parents had picked out together with their own gaudy, overpriced decorations. Then, they took over entire rooms. Lisa turned the guest room into her personal walk-in closet, stuffing it with piles of clothes and shoes she never wore, while Kelly claimed the downstairs den as her meditation space and forbade my dad from using it. But the worst part was how they treated him. My dad, the man who had worked his whole life to provide for our family, was slowly being treated like an afterthought in his own home. He went from being the homeowner to feeling like a guest. He was ignored in conversations, dismissed when he voiced his opinion, and over time, he just stopped trying. Every time I visited, I saw the changes in him. He seemed quieter, more withdrawn, like he was shrinking under the weight of being constantly pushed aside. The few times he actually put his foot down, Diana would swoop in with her manipulative charm, acting like he was the unreasonable one. She'd say things like, "Oh Henry, you're just being dramatic," or, "Come on, it's just a house. We're all family here." And Lisa and Kelly would back her up, rolling their eyes and acting like my dad was some grumpy old man who needed to get with the times. I tried to intervene. I told him to stand up for himself, to remind them that this was his house, not theirs. But every time I brought it up, he just shook his head and gave me a tired smile. "It's not worth the fight, Alex," he'd say. "I'm too old for all that arguing." I hated seeing him like that. And then, 5 years after Diana moved in, my father's health started to decline. At first, it was little things. He'd forget where he put his keys, he'd get tired more easily, he'd lose track of conversations. But then, it got worse. His balance was off, his hands would shake when he tried to hold a glass of water, and one day, he called me and couldn't remember what he was trying to say. I told him I was coming over immediately, but when I got there, Diana brushed it off like it was nothing. "Oh, Henry's just having one of his off days," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand, like my father's deteriorating health was some minor inconvenience. Lisa and Kelly barely even looked up from their phones when I walked in. I demanded we take him to a doctor, but Diana insisted that he was fine, that he just needed to rest. My dad, ever the peacekeeper, agreed with her. "No need to fuss, Alex," he said, even as he struggled to stand up from his chair. I didn't care what Diana said. I took him to the hospital myself. That was when we got the diagnosis: Parkinson's. I sat in that sterile white room next to my father as the doctor explained what it meant, what the progression would look like, how his body would slowly betray him. My dad just nodded, calm as ever, but I could see it in his eyes. He knew this was the beginning of the end. I wanted to bring him home with me. I offered, begged him even. I told him I'd move things around, make space, do whatever it took to take care of him. But he wouldn't hear it. "This is my home," he said. "I can't just leave." I knew what he meant. He wasn't just talking about the house. He was talking about my mom, about the life they had built together. He couldn't walk away from that, even if it meant staying in a place where he was no longer truly wanted. Over the next 2 years, things got worse. His body weakened, his speech slowed, and he started needing help with the simplest task. And Diana? She barely lifted a finger. Lisa and Kelly acted like he was an inconvenience, rolling their eyes when he needed assistance, making comments about how hard it was for them to live with someone who required so much care. They treated him like dead weight, like he was in their way. And then, one day, Diana made the decision without even consulting me. She put him in a hospice. She called me after it was already done. "It was just too much, Alex," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "He needed professional care. It's for the best." I was furious. Not because hospice care was necessarily the wrong choice, but because she had done it behind my back, without even giving my dad the dignity of discussing it with his own son. I drove to see him that same day. When I walked into his room, he looked smaller than ever, lying in that hospital bed, his eyes tired but still carrying that familiar warmth when he saw me. "Hey kid," he said, his voice weak but steady. I sat beside him, gripping his hand. "Dad, why didn't you tell me?" He just sighed. "I didn't want to burden you, Alex." That was the kind of man he was. Even as his body failed him, he didn't want to be a problem for anyone. I told him I had a surprise for him. I left the room and came back with Max. The moment my dad saw him, his whole face lit up. Max, even in his old age, still had that same loyalty, that same love for my father. He gently rested his head on my dad's lap, letting out a soft whine, like he knew this was goodbye. My dad ran his shaking hand over Max's fur, whispering, "Hey, buddy. I missed you." And then, the door slammed open. Diana, Lisa, and Kelly stormed in, looking furious. What the hell is that dog doing here? Kelly snapped, arms crossed like she had any right to be mad. I stood up, facing them. He's here to say goodbye to my dad. Diana scoffed. You can't just bring a filthy animal into a medical facility, Alec. It's unsanitary. It's against the rules. I turned to my dad. Do you want him here? My dad, weak but firm, nodded. Yes. Diana huffed, clearly pissed that she wasn't getting her way. You always have to make everything about you, don't you, Alex? She sneered. This isn't your decision to make. I clenched my fists, holding back everything I wanted to say. Instead, I just looked at my father. I'm staying with you, Dad. Lisa scoffed. For what? He's already checked out of the house. Just let it go, Alex. Let it go. That's what they wanted. For me to let go, to walk away, to let them keep everything they had taken. But I wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. Losing my dad was one of the hardest things I've ever had to go through. Even though I had seen it coming, even though I had prepared myself for it, nothing could take away the sting of knowing he was really gone. The only thing that gave me any peace was knowing that, in his final moments, I had been there. That he had gotten to see Max one last time. That no matter what Diana and her daughters tried to do, they hadn't been able to take that from him. After the funeral, I didn't hear from Diana for a few days. She and her daughters kept their distance, probably assuming I was too caught up in grief to think about anything else. And maybe, for a little while, I was. But there was something looming over all of us, something they had conveniently ignored for years. What would happen to the house? Diana and her daughters had been living there for over 5 years, acting as if they owned the place. They had pushed my father into the background, made him feel like a guest in his own home, and when he got sick, they discarded him like he was an inconvenience. Now that he was gone, I knew exactly what they thought was going to happen. They thought they could just stay. I waited a full week before going over. I wanted to be as calm and collected as possible, and I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of thinking they had the upper hand. When I arrived, I found Diana in the kitchen sipping coffee, Lisa sprawled out on the couch watching TV, and Kelly, as usual, doing absolutely nothing productive. They were comfortable, too comfortable, and that only made what I had to say even more satisfying. I sat down across from Diana, who gave me a tight smile, as if she thought we were about to have some heartfelt conversation about grief and moving forward. Before she could say anything, I laid it out plainly. Diana, we need to talk about the house. She raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting that to be the topic of discussion. What about it? I leaned back in my chair, keeping my tone even. You and your daughters have 2 choices. You can start paying rent, $5,000 a month, or you can move out. The reaction was immediate. Kelly nearly choked on whatever overpriced smoothie she was drinking. Lisa sat up like I had just smacked her in the face, and Diana, her face went pale for just a second before she quickly composed herself. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice sharp. I took my time before answering, letting the weight of my words settle over them. This house was never my father's. It was mine. I bought it. I own it. And now that he's gone, you're either my tenants or you're trespassers. So you can either pay up or find somewhere else to live. The silence that followed was almost comical. I could see the gears turning in Diana's head, could practically hear Lisa and Kelly scrambling for an argument. You can't be serious, Diana finally said, her voice shaking just slightly. Henry put my name on the deed. I smiled. No, he didn't. I checked. The house was always in my name. He had the right to live here, but he never had the right to give it away. Lisa scoffed. This is ridiculous. We've been living here for years. This is our home. I turned to her, my expression unreadable. No, it was my father's home. And he's gone. Now it's mine again. Kelly, who had been silent up until now, suddenly found her voice. You can't just evict us. That's illegal. I leaned forward, folding my hands together. Actually, I can. But I'm giving you a choice. I'm not throwing you out tomorrow. I'm giving you 45 days to decide. Pay the rent or pack your things and leave. If you don't make a decision, I'll start the legal eviction process, and trust me, that will be a lot worse for you. Diana's face hardened. Henry would never have wanted this, she spat, grasping for some kind of leverage. He would have wanted us to stay. I held her gaze, unflinching. My dad would have wanted to live his last years in peace, not being pushed aside in his own house. He would have wanted to spend his final days feeling like he still mattered, not being treated like a burden by you and your daughters. But you didn't care about what he wanted then, so don't pretend to care now. She clenched her jaw, her hands tightening around her coffee cup, but she had nothing to say to that. Lisa shook her head, letting out a bitter laugh. Unbelievable. You're really kicking us out. I shrugged. I'm giving you an option. You have 45 days to figure it out. Diana stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the tile floor. You're making a huge mistake, Alex. You're going to regret this. I stood up too, looking her dead in the eye. No, Diana. The only mistake was letting you into this house in the first place. I turned and walked out, leaving them to sit in the reality of their situation. 45 days. That was more than fair. And I wasn't about to change my mind. After I gave Diana and her daughters 45 days to either start paying rent or move out, I expected them to make a scene. What I didn't expect was for Diana to take things to the next level by trying to sue me. About 2 weeks after I laid down the terms, I got served with legal papers. Diana was suing me, claiming that my father had promised her the house and that she had a legal right to stay. The lawsuit was a joke from the start. She had no documents, no contract, nothing but her own word that my father had supposedly made this promise. I knew she was grasping at straws, trying to stall, hoping that if she made enough noise, I would back down. I didn't. I hired a lawyer, gathered every piece of paperwork I had on the house, and walked into that courtroom fully prepared to shut this whole thing down. Diana, of course, showed up acting like the grieving widow, dressed in all black with a somber expression, as if this was some kind of tragic injustice being done to her. Lisa and Kelly sat beside her, whispering and shooting me dirty looks like I was some kind of villain. The judge wasted no time. The first thing he asked for was proof. Any kind of documentation that showed my father had intended to leave Diana the house. She had nothing. No will, no contract, no written agreement, just her claim that my dad had always said he wanted her to have the house. My lawyer calmly presented the actual deed, which had been in my name since the day I bought the house. He also pointed out that my father had never owned the house to begin with, meaning he couldn't have promised it to anyone. The judge barely even had to think about it. Within 20 minutes, the case was dismissed. Diana, of course, wasn't happy. She tried to argue, claiming the decision was unfair, that my father's verbal wishes should be honored, that this wasn't about legalities but about what's right. The judge didn't even entertain it. He simply reminded her that without any proof, there was nothing to discuss. Then, just to make things even better, the court not only confirmed that I was the sole owner of the house, but they also issued an order giving Diana and her daughters just 14 days to vacate the property. The moment those words left the judge's mouth, I saw Diana's whole face drop. Lisa and Kelly started whispering frantically, probably realizing they had officially lost. I didn't smile, didn't react, just watched as reality finally started sinking in for them. As soon as we left the courtroom, Diana stormed up to me in the hallway, furious. "You think you've won, but you're going to regret this," she hissed, her voice dripping with bitterness. I just looked at her, calm as ever. "No, Diana. The only thing I regret is letting you into my father's life in the first place." Then I turned and walked away, leaving her and her daughters to figure out where they were going to live next. They had 14 days. And this time, there was nothing they could do about it. After losing the lawsuit, Diana, Lisa, and Kelly had no choice but to pack up and leave. The court had made it clear that they had no legal right to the house, and with only 14 days to vacate, they scrambled to figure out their next move. I didn't go back to the house while they were still there. I wasn't interested in any last-minute theatrics, fake apologies, or desperate pleas for sympathy. I had given them more than enough time to do the right thing, and they had chosen to fight me instead. From what I heard later, they tried to find an apartment in the same area, hoping to stay close to their old lifestyle. But reality hit them hard. The rental prices in that prestigious neighborhood were well beyond their means, and without my father's house to mooch off of, they quickly realized they couldn't afford to stay. I won't lie, I took a little satisfaction in knowing that the same luxury they had taken for granted was now completely out of reach. With no other options, they ended up moving 300 kilometers away to a much cheaper region, a place where rent was low enough for them to survive. I didn't bother finding out where exactly they landed. As far as I was concerned, they were out of my life for good, and that was all that mattered. When I finally walked back into my house, because yes, it was my house again, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. The air felt lighter, the space felt open, and for the first time in a long time, it actually felt like home. I spent the next few weeks undoing all the damage they had done, getting rid of every trace of them, replacing the furniture they had brought in, and restoring the place to what it was meant to be. And of course, I brought Max back. He was older now, slower, but the moment he stepped back inside, he knew he was home too. He sniffed around for a while, then curled up in the spot he had always loved near the window, letting out a deep sigh as if he had been waiting for this moment just as much as I had. Diana, Lisa, and Kelly had come into my father's life thinking they could take everything. They had treated him like an inconvenience, pushed him aside, and assumed they could walk away with the home I had bought for him. They had believed they could manipulate their way into a future of comfort and security at my expense. But in the end, they walked away with nothing. I had my house back, I had my peace back, and best of all, I had gotten rid of them forever.